Have you ever heard of the prophet who wept? The Bible tells us about a man known as the weeping prophet, but don't think he was just emotional. This man faced persecution, torture, and even assassination attempts because of his message. Want to know who he is and why his story is so impressive? Today, I'll tell you all about Jeremiah, the prophet who wept. Jeremiah's story began when he was just a young man, around his early 20s. Life was peaceful, ordinary, when suddenly God appeared to him and said, "Jeremiah, before you were born, I had already chosen you to be a prophet." Can you imagine the shock? The young Jeremiah, startled, replied, "Wait, Lord, I'm too young for this. I don't even know how to speak properly." But God did not accept his excuses, saying, "Don't say you're too young. You will speak everything I command you." And that wasn't all. God touched Jeremiah's mouth and said, "I am putting my words in your mouth. From today, you will speak to nations and kingdoms, to uproot and tear down, to build up and to plant." An immense responsibility. But Jeremiah knew it was just the beginning. Then, God showed Jeremiah two intriguing visions. First, he saw a branch of an almond tree, and God explained, "I am watching over my word to fulfill it." Then Jeremiah saw a boiling pot tilting from the north, and God told him this meant danger would come from that direction. God then got straight to the point, saying, "Get ready, Jeremiah. Kings, officials, and people will fight against you, but don't worry. I'm with you. I'll protect you." Imagine Jeremiah's thoughts. The young man, barely out of his teenage years, now had this gigantic mission. But God doesn't choose the capable. He equips the chosen. And so began Jeremiah's incredible journey as God's prophet. Jeremiah's ministry began during the reign of King Josiah, a good king trying to reform the nation by eliminating idols and pagan practices. But the people's hearts remained unchanged, only pretending to follow God on the surface. In this environment, God sent Jeremiah to deliver a powerful message. Imagine the scene: a young prophet standing in the temple, proclaiming, "You think it's enough to come to the temple and shout, 'This is the temple of the Lord,' for everything to be fine? Not at all. If you don't change your ways, God will destroy this place just like he did Shiloh." The people were shocked. How could the temple be destroyed? It was their center of worship, their symbol of connection to God. But Jeremiah's message was clear. Superficial religion would not protect them. Jeremiah's warnings didn't stop there. To grab the people's attention, he began performing symbolic acts. Once, he took a linen belt, wore it for a time, and then buried it near a river. Later, he dug it up, and the belt was ruined. Jeremiah used this to show that God would ruin their pride if they did not turn back to him. Another time, God sent him to a potter's house. There, he saw the potter reshaping a misshapen pot. Jeremiah used this image to show that just as the potter reshapes the clay, God could remake his people if they repented. But Jeremiah's messages were hard to hear. He spoke of judgment, punishment, and foreign invasion. Imagine hearing that your beloved city would be destroyed, that you would be taken captive in another land. It wasn't a message that people wanted to receive. As he continued preaching, opposition against him grew. People didn't want to hear warnings and judgments. No one likes being told they're wrong and that punishment is coming. At first, people just ignored him, thinking, "Oh, he's just another prophet talking nonsense. He'll go away soon." But Jeremiah didn't stop. Day after day, week after week, he continued preaching. Over time, irritation grew, and people began mocking him, laughing at his words, calling him names. Imagine the scene. Jeremiah standing in the town square, announcing God's judgment, with people gathered around, laughing, making jokes. But Jeremiah didn't give up. He knew God had called him, and he would fulfill his mission, no matter the cost. When Jeremiah began prophesying against the religious leaders, things became even more dangerous. He accused priests and false prophets of deceiving the people by telling them everything was fine when, in reality, disaster was near. The religious leaders were furious, seeing Jeremiah as a threat to their power. They began plotting ways to silence him. One day, while Jeremiah was preaching in the temple, the priests and false prophets seized him, shouting, "You must die. How dare you say this temple will be destroyed?" The crowd joined in, yelling for his death. Jeremiah was brought before the princes of Judah to be judged, and he stood firm, declaring, "The Lord sent me to prophesy against this city. If you kill me, you will bring innocent blood upon yourselves." In the end, some elders intervened, reminding everyone that past prophets like Micah had also spoken harsh truths without being killed. So, Jeremiah was freed this time, but the opposition against him would only continue to grow. Then, during King Jehoiakim's reign, God commanded Jeremiah to write down all the prophecies he had given so far. Jeremiah called his scribe Baruch and dictated the words. Once complete, Jeremiah told Baruch, "I am forbidden from entering the temple, so go and read this scroll to the people. Perhaps they'll repent." Baruch obeyed, reading the scroll aloud at the temple. The people were shocked. News reached the king's officials, who decided to inform the king. At that moment, King Jehoiakim was in his winter palace, sitting by a fire. As the scroll was read to him, he did something shocking. He cut each section as it was read and threw it into the fire. Imagine this scene. The king systematically destroyed the words of warning from God. Some officials pleaded with him to stop, but he wouldn't listen. When the scroll was completely burned, he ordered Jeremiah and Baruch to be arrested. But God hid them, and then told Jeremiah to write the words again. Jeremiah obeyed, dictating everything once more, even adding new words of judgment against Jehoiakim. One of Jeremiah's most striking symbolic actions involved a yoke, a wooden piece used to join oxen to a plow. God commanded him to wear this yoke and walk through Jerusalem, symbolizing that all nations, including Judah, would be subject to Babylon's rule. A false prophet named Hananiah opposed Jeremiah, claiming that God would break Babylon's yoke in just 2 years. To dramatize this, Hananiah broke the yoke from Jeremiah's neck. Jeremiah then delivered an even harsher message, saying that instead of a wooden yoke, they would bear an iron one, and he prophesied that Hananiah would die that same year. This episode illustrates the conflicts Jeremiah faced with false prophets who preach pleasant messages not from God. As Babylon's army surrounded Jerusalem, Jeremiah's warnings became even more dangerous. Many saw him as a traitor, as he urged surrender to Babylon, saying it was the only way to survive. Enraged, a group of officials told King Zedekiah, "This man must die. He's discouraging our soldiers, weak and indecisive." Zedekiah allowed it, and the officials threw Jeremiah into a cistern filled with mud, where he began to sink. They intended for him to die there alone, slowly. But God was not finished with Jeremiah. An Ethiopian official named Ebed-Melech heard of Jeremiah's plight. He went to the king and said, "These men have acted wickedly against the prophet." The king, changing his mind again, allowed Ebed-Melech to rescue Jeremiah. Using ropes and old rags, Ebed-Melech and others pulled him out of the cistern. This episode shows the extreme danger Jeremiah faced for his faithfulness to God's message and how God continued to protect him, even in his darkest moments. Finally, Jeremiah's prophecies were fulfilled. Babylon invaded Jerusalem, destroying the city and temple. King Zedekiah tried to escape but was captured. His sons were killed before him, and his eyes were gouged out. Surprisingly, Nebuchadnezzar gave special orders regarding Jeremiah, allowing him to stay in Judah with the remnant of the people or go to Babylon. Jeremiah chose to stay, comforting those left behind, encouraging them to submit to Babylon as God had willed. Despite the fulfillment of his prophecies, Jeremiah found no joy in this vindication. Instead, he mourned deeply for his people and city. In the book of Lamentations, we see his grief for the destruction of Jerusalem and his people's suffering. After the fall of Jerusalem, a group of Jews, fearing Babylonian reprisals, decided to flee to Egypt. They asked Jeremiah for counsel, promising to follow God's guidance. But when Jeremiah told them to stay in Judah, they accused him of lying. Ignoring his warning, they took him to Egypt with them, where Jeremiah continued to warn them against idolatry. Tradition holds that Jeremiah may have even been stoned by these same people for his messages. Despite being known as the weeping prophet, Jeremiah didn't only preach judgment and destruction. Some of his most famous prophecies are messages of hope. He spoke of a new covenant where God would write his law on the people's hearts and of a righteous king from David's line, a prophecy that Christians see fulfilled in Jesus Christ. He also prophesied that after 70 years, God would bring his people back